welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishineff, and we're reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Tonight we're going to start Chapter 4. Remember, if you like what you hear, like the episode, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Chapter 4, Bloody Footprints. And the blurb at the beginning, a quotation, for the first 200 years of our military heritage, then Americans depended on arts of war that contemporary professional soldiers supposedly abhorred, raising and destroying enemy villages and fields, killing enemy women and children, raiding settlements for captives, intimidating and brutalizing enemy non-combatants, and assassinating enemy leaders. In the frontier wars between 1607 and 1814, Americans forged two elements, unlimited war and irregular war, into their first way of war. John Grenier, The First Way of War. Within days of the assassination of Osama bin Laden on May 1st, does that say the 1st? May 2nd, excuse me. May 2nd, 2011, it was revealed that... Start over. Within days of the assassination of Osama bin Laden on May 2nd, 2011, it was revealed that the Navy SEAL team executing the mission had used the codename Geronimo for its target. A May 4th report in the New York Daily News commented, along with the unseen pictures of Osama bin Laden's corpse and questions about what Pakistan knew, intelligence officials' reasons for dubbing the Al-Qaeda boss Geronimo remain one of the biggest mysteries of the Black Ops mission. The choice of that code name was not a mystery to the military, which also uses the term Indian country to designate enemy territory and identifies its killing machines and operations with such names as UH-IBC Iroquois, OH-58D Kiowa, OV-1 Mohawk, OH-6 Cayuse, AH-64 Apache, S-58 H-34 Choctaw, UH-60 Blackhawk, Thunderbird, and Rolling Thunder. The last of these is the military name given to the relentless carpet bombing of Vietnamese peasants in the mid-1960s. Rolling Thunder. There are many other current and recent examples of the persistence of the colonialist and imperialist sensibilities at the core of a military grounded in wars against the indigenous nations and communities of North America. And I gotta say, I did not realize how many of those military machines did have Native American names. I mean, I've heard of the Apache and the Blackhawk, obviously. I think most of us have. But I've never heard of the Iroquois, the Kiowa, the Mohawk, the Cayuse, or the Thunderbird. I'm not even sure what that refers to. On February 19th, 1991, Brigadier General Richard Neal, briefing reporters in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, stated that the U.S. military wanted to be certain of speedy victory once it committed land forces to Indian country. The following day, in a little publicized statement of protest, The National Congress of American Indians pointed out that 15,000 Native Americans were serving as combat troops in the Persian Gulf. Neither Neal nor any other military authority apologized for that statement. The term Indian country in cases such as this is not merely an insensitive racial slur, tastelessly but offhandedly employed to refer to the enemy. It is rather a technical military term, like collateral damage or ordnance, that appears in military training manuals and is regularly used to mean behind enemy lines. It is often shortened to in country. This usage recalls the origins and development of the U.S. military, as well as the nature of U.S. political and social history as a colonialist project. Furthermore, Indian country is a legal term that identifies native jurisdiction under U.S. colonial laws, but is also an important tool for native nations to use in maintaining and expanding their land in the process of decolonization. Indian country, the legal term, includes not only federally recognized reservation territories, but also informal reservations, dependent native communities, and allotments in specially designated lands. Roots of genocide. In the first wave of war, American war making on the frontier, 1607 to 1814, military historian John Grenier, who was quoted at the beginning of this chapter, offers an indispensable analysis of the colonialist warfare against the indigenous peoples of the North American territories claimed by Great Britain. The way of war, largely devised and enacted by settlers, formed the basis for the founding ideology and colonialist military strategy of the independent United States. And this approach to war is still in force in the 21st century. Grenier writes that he began his study with the goal of tracing the historical roots of the use of unlimited war by the United States. War whose purpose is to destroy the will of the enemy or their capacity to resist, employing any means necessary, but mainly by attacking civilians and their support systems, such as food supply. Today called special operations or low-intensity conflict. That kind of warfare was first used against indigenous communities by colonial militias in Virginia and Massachusetts. These irregular forces made up of settlers sought to disrupt every aspect of resistance as well as to obtain intelligence through scouting and taking prisoners. They did so by destroying indigenous villages and fields and intimidating and slaughtering enemy non-combatant populations. Women, children, old people. Grenier analyzes the development of the U.S. way of war from 1607 to 1814, during which the U.S. military was forged, leading to its reproduction and development into the present. U.S. historian Bernard Bailyn calls the period barbarous and a conflict of civilizations, but Bailyn represents the indigenous civilization as marauders that the European settlers needed to get rid of. From this formative period, Grenier argues, emerged problematic characteristics of the U.S. way of war, and thereby the characteristics of its civilization, which few historians have come to terms with. In the beginning, Anglo settlers organized irregular units to brutally attack and destroy unarmed indigenous women, children, and old people, using unlimited violence and unrelenting attacks. Want to vomit yet? During nearly 2 centuries of British colonization, generations of settlers, mostly farmers, gained experience as Indian fighters outside any organized military institution. Anglo-French conflict may appear to have been the dominant factor of European colonization in North America during the 18th century, but while large regular armies fought over geopolitical goals in Europe, Anglo settlers in North America waged deadly irregular warfare against the indigenous communities. Much of the fighting during the 15-year settlers' war for independence, especially in the Ohio Valley region and western New York, was directed against indigenous resistors who realized it was not in their interest to have a close enemy of settlers with an independent government as opposed to a remote one in Great Britain. Nor did the fledgling U.S. military in the 1790s carry out operations typical of the state-centered wars occurring in Europe at the time. Even following the founding of the professional U.S. Army in the 1810s, irregular warfare was the method of the U.S. conquest of the Ohio Valley and Mississippi Valley regions. Since that time, Grenier notes, irregular methods have been used in tandem with operations of regular armed forces. The chief characteristic of irregular warfare is that of the extreme violence against civilians. In this case, the tendency to seek the utter annihilation of the indigenous population. In cases where a rough balance of power existed, Grenier observes, and the Indians even appeared dominant, as was the situation in virtually every frontier war until the first decade of the 19th century, settler Americans were quick to turn to extravagant violence. We have such a lovely history. But all history is lovely, isn't it? Many historians who acknowledge the exceptional one-sided colonial violence attribute it to racism. Grenier argues that rather than racism leading to violence, the reverse occurred. The out-of-control momentum of extreme violence of unlimited warfare fueled race hatred. Successive generations of Americans, both soldiers and civilians, made the killing of Indian men, women, and children a defining element of their first military tradition and thereby part of a shared American identity. Indeed, only after the 17th and early 18th century, Americans made the first way of war a key to being a white American could later generations of Indian haters, men like Andrew Jackson, turn the Indian Wars into race wars. By then, the indigenous peoples' villages, farmlands, towns, and entire nations formed the only barrier to the settlers' total freedom to acquire land and wealth. Settler colonialists again chose their own means of conquest. Such fighters are often viewed as courageous heroes, but killing the unarmed women, children, and old people, and burning homes and fields involved neither courage nor sacrifice. So it was from the planting of the first British colonies in North America. Among the initial leaders of those ventures were military men, mercenaries who brought with them their previous war experiences in Britain's imperialist anti-Muslim crusades. Those who put together and led the first colonial armies, such as John Smith in Virginia, Miles Standish at Plymouth, John Mason in Connecticut, and John Underhill in Massachusetts, had fought in the bitter, brutal, and bloody religious wars ongoing in Europe at the time of the first settlements. They had long practiced burning towns and fields and killing the unarmed and vulnerable. Tragically for the Indian peoples of the eastern seaboard, Grenier observes, the mercenaries unleashed a similar way of war in early Virginia and New England. Settler parasites create the Virginia colony. The first Jamestown settlers lacked a supply line and proved unable or unwilling to grow crops or hunt for their own sustenance. They decided that they would force the farmers of the Powhatan Confederacy, some 30 polities, to provide them with food. Jamestown military leader John Smith threatened to kill all the women and children if the Powhatan leaders would not feed and clothe the settlers, as well as provide them with land and labor. The leader of the Confederacy, Wahunsonacock, hope I pronounced that right. That's a scary looking name. Sorry. Wahunsonacock entreated the invaders, "Why should you take by force that from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? What is the cause of your jealousy? You see us unarmed and willing to supply your wants if you will come in a friendly manner and not with swords and guns as to invade an enemy." Smith's threat was carried out. War against the Powhatans started in August 1609, and the destruction of the Powhatans became the order of the day. The war dragged on for a year, until the English governor, Thomas Gage, ordered forces mobilized by George Percy, a mercenary who had fought in the Netherlands to take revenge and destroy the indigenous population. In his report following the assault, Percy gloated over the gruesome details of killing all the children. Despite the terrorizing tactics of the settlers, the Powhatans were able to protect their grain storage buildings and force the Jamestown settlers to shelter within their colonial fortress. Meanwhile, the Powhatans organized a stronger confederacy. In 1622, they attacked all the English settlements along the James River, killing 350, a third of the settler population. Unable to eliminate the indigenous population by force of arms, the colonists resorted to a feed fight, as Grenier identifies it. Systematic destruction of all the indigenous agricultural resources. A dozen years later, an even greater conflict broke out, the Tidewater War, 1644 to 46. Hardly a war. It consisted rather of settlers continuously raiding indigenous villages and fields, with the goal of starving the people out of the area. There followed 3 decades of peace, from which the settlers inferred the total war and expulsion of the indigenous people worked. The few indigenous families that remained in eastern Virginia were under the absolute dominance of the English. It was clear, Grenier points out, that the English would tolerate Indians within and near their settlements, provided they essentially neither saw nor heard them. In the absence of indigenous sources of food and labor, the colonists brought in enslaved Africans and indentured European servants to do the work. By 1676, the settler population of Virginia had mushroomed, and English tobacco farmers were encroaching on the lands of the Susquehannock people. When the Susquehannocks resisted, a war broke out that went badly for the English. In 1676, the Virginia House of Burgesses formed a mounted force of 125 men to range through a particular cluster of indigenous villages and thereby overcome Susquehannock resistance. This was the immediate background of Bacon's rebellion, so beloved by populist U.S. historians and those who search for the onset of racialized servitude in the British colonies. The rebellion occurred when Anglo settler farmers, along with landless indentured servants, both Anglo and African, took into their own hands the slaughter of indigenous farmers with the aim of taking their land. The plantation owners who ruled the colony were troubled, to be sure, by the interracial aspect of the uprising. Soon after, Virginia law made greater distinction between indentured servants and slaves and codified the permanent status of slavery for Africans. The point is an important one, but there is a larger issue. Bacon's rebellion affected the development of genocidal policies aimed at the indigenous peoples, namely, the creation of wealth in the colonies based on landholding and the use of landless or land-poor settler farmers as foot soldiers for moving the settlement frontier deeper into indigenous territories. That the rebellion's leader, Nathaniel Bacon, was a wealthy planter reveals the relationship between the wealthy landed settlers and the poorer, often landless settlers. Historian Eric Foner rightly concludes that the rebellion was a power play by Bacon against the Virginia governor William Berkeley and his planter allies, as Bacon's financial backers included other wealthy planters opposed to Berkeley. In the name of God, what transpired up the coast in the founding and growth of the New England colony was different, at least at first. Just before the 1620 landing of the Mayflower, smallpox had spread from English trading ships off the coast to the Pequot fishing and farming communities on land, greatly reducing the population of the area the Plymouth colony would occupy even. King James attributed the epidemic to God's great goodness and bounty toward us. Consequently, those who survived in the indigenous communities had little means to immediately resist the settlers' expropriation of their lands and resources. 16 years later, however, the indigenous villages had recovered and were considered a barrier to the settlements moving into Pequot territory in Connecticut. A single violent incident triggered a devastating Puritan war against the Pequots in what the colony's annals and subsequent history texts call the Pequot War. The Puritan settlers, as if by instinct, jumped immediately into a hideous war of annihilation, entering indigenous villages and killing women and children or taking them hostage. The Pequots responded by attacking English settlements, including Fort Saybrook in Connecticut. Connecticut authorities commissioned mercenary John Mason to lead a force of soldiers from that colony and Massachusetts to one of the two Pequot strongholds on the Mystic River. Pequot fighters occupied one of the forts, while the other one contained only women, children, and old men. The latter was the one John Mason targeted. Slaughter ensued. After killing most of the Pequot defenders, the soldiers set fire to the structures and burned the remaining inhabitants alive. Now you want to find it? If you're still hanging in there, nice job. I appreciate you hanging in there. It's important stuff to know. It's not easy, but it's important. This kind of war was alien to the indigenous peoples. According to their ways of war, when relations between groups broke down and conflict came, war was highly ritualized, with quests for individual glory resulting in few deaths. Colonial wars inevitably drew other indigenous communities in on one side or the other. During the Pequot War, neighboring Narragansett villages allied with the Puritans in hopes of reaping a large harvest of captives, booty, and glory. But after the carnage was done, the Narragansetts left the Puritan side in disgust, saying that the English were too furious and slayed too many men. After having made the Pequots the enemy, the settlers set out to complete the destruction. Fewer than 200 half-starved Pequots remained of the 2,000 at the beginning of the war. Although they had ceased fighting and were without any means of defense, the settlers started a new attack on the Pequots. The colony commissioned the mercenary Mason and his mercenary crew of 40 men to burn the few remaining homes and fields. Puritan William Bradford wrote at the time in his History of Plymouth Plantation, "Those that escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Some hewed to pieces, others hewn through with their rapiers, so as they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was conceived they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was the stink and scent thereof, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof of God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands, and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy." The other indigenous nations of the region assessed what was in store for them and accepted tributary status under the colonial authority. During the late 17th century, Anglo settlers in New England began the routine practice of scalp hunting and what Grenier identifies as ranging, the use of settler ranger forces. By that time, the non-indigenous population of the English colony in North America had increased sixfold to more than 150,000, which meant that settlers were intruding on more of the indigenous homelands. Indigenous resistance followed in what the settlers called King Philip's War. Wampanoag people and their indigenous allies attacked their settlers' isolated farms using a method of guerrilla warfare that relied on speed and caution in striking and retreating. The settlers scorned this kind of resistance as skulking and responded by destroying indigenous villages. Again, extirpation. But indigenous guerrilla attacks continued, and so the commander of the Plymouth militia, Benjamin Church, studied indigenous tactics in order to develop a more effective kind of preemption. he petitioned the colony's governor for permission to choose 60 to 70 settlers to serve as scouts, as he called them, for what he termed wilderness warfare. In July 1676, the first settler organized ranger force was the result. The Rangers, 60 settlers and 140 colonized indigenous men, were to discover, pursue, fight, surprise, destroy, or subdue the enemy, in Church's words. The inclusion of indigenous fighters on the colonist side has marked settler colonialism and foreign occupations ever since. The settler rangers could learn from their native aides, then discard them. In the following 2 decades, Church perfected his evolving method of annihilation. Thanks for joining me. Hope you liked the episode. If you did, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next episode.